So my grandmother was born in 1914, and this is the way that they did their green beans, which is called leather britches. So if you're from the Appalachians or the South, you're probably familiar with leather britches, but it is a way of stringing and drying the bean harvest. So she did do a lot of canning, but there's only so many jars, and in some years, especially years like during the Great Depression, jars were an added expense. So this is a very old historical way of drying the harvest when you didn't have dehydrators or other means of preserving them. So these strands I strung and dried. This one has been about almost 3 months old now, and this one is about 2 months old. But to prepare your leather britches, because they are fully dehydrated, it's not quite the same as just cooking them as if they were fresh, or obviously opening a jar of canned green beans and then just heating them. There is a 2-step process that needs to be done. So back in the day, my grandfather built like racks that you could dry around their wood stovepipe, because that's the only way they didn't have electricity. And so they used the wood stove to do all of the cooking, but they would also use that extra heat to help dry things. And then in the attics, they would hang all of these bean garlands, so to speak, and that was their food storage and how they would keep it through the winter. However, things get dusty, especially if they've been sitting for months. So in order to rehydrate these and also clean them, we're gonna be putting them in this bowl and covering them with water that has just come off the boil. So I just snipped the end of the string off here and the knot. And so we're gonna pull these off. And because they were in their whole form, meaning I didn't snap these, and usually these are a snap bean, so I'll snap them. I don't can them or eat them in their whole form. If some of them break a little bit as we're pulling them off of here, no big deal. So you can see this is the older one, and the leather britches, because they turn kind of the color of leather. The older they are, the longer they've been drying, they're gonna get brown. And then this one over here has not been hanging as long. So it's still brittle and fully dry, no mold, but you don't see it, it hasn't turned this brown color yet. All right, so here is our bowl full of beans, and now we're going to make sure we got all the string out, because nobody wants to eat string. Oh, that's just a string off my beans, making sure. All righty. So this is to help rehydrate the beans, because obviously they are fully dried. And these are kind of a dual purpose bean, meaning some of the ones that are a little bit more mature actually have a dried bean inside the pod. And so I wanna make sure that that is also getting rehydrated, but this is gonna help rehydrate them. So we're gonna let this soak for an hour to 2 hours. The longer they've been dry, the longer I find it takes them to rehydrate back. But this is also going to help clean them. So we're gonna let them sit and soak in this really warm, hot water. Hot tap water is fine. We have our hot water tank turned down just a little bit, so it's not super hot, so I just boiled this water. But then we'll strain them, and that's gonna remove and rinse off all of the dust that they have been gathering while they've been drying and stored throughout the months, especially if this was more towards the latter part of the year and they had been in an attic or in an area for 6 to 9 months. So this has been right at about 2 hours. So you can see these are a lot more pliable. Even the larger ones, and you can see these ones actually have the larger bean inside of the pod, but you can see they're starting to soak back up their moisture, but they're still a little bit shriveled. So they're not ever going to come to complete state of fresh once they've been dehydrated. And here you can even see there's a little bit of that bean. And so it's somewhat soft. You can see how it's, this is rehydrated up as well. So we want to get these rinsed off and drained. Traditionally, my grandmother would have cooked these on a wood stove, and they would have been simmering from about 3 to 6 hours, depending on how long they had been dehydrated, until they were fully cooked. However, this time of year, I don't actually need my wood stove going for that many hours. So I am going to be cooking these the modern equivalent, and we're going to be using the Instant Pot. But because we do have dried beans inside, and the dried beans inside these pods, they're very, very similar to a navy bean in texture, in taste, in size. So even though these are green beans, we are gonna be cooking them as if they were a dried bean. However, we have soaked these, so that's gonna help with our cook time. So you wanna make sure that you're using some extra water because these are going to soak up even more water once they begin cooking inside of our pressure cooker. But there's one more ingredient that needs to be added to these that make them taste spectacular and also keeps them more historically accurate. Now, traditionally, salt pork is what was used to flavor your green beans. So my grandmother always used salt pork, and then because salt pork, of course, has a lot of salt, I'm sure that the name gave it away there, but you didn't have to add any additional salt to whatever dish you were cooking. You would just put a couple of pieces of salt pork in, and then that would infuse in the beans while it was cooking. And usually they didn't even eat the pieces of salt pork because they are so salty, but it would flavor and infuse the whole dish. And that's because going back, pre-refrigeration and the way that we have meats now, that was how their hogs were cured to last through the winter months, was by salt curing. And so they learned how to use every little bit of that meat in order to take them through the whole winter. And of course they had other chickens and cattle and other sources of meat. But traditionally, my grandmother always used salt pork. And even when I was a kid growing up, she wasn't raising hogs anymore. It was just my grandmother. My grandfather had passed away, and obviously she had no kids left at home because my dad was old enough to have children. And so she would still just buy salt pork from the store to use whenever she was cooking both her green beans and then even her shelled beans as well. Now, I don't actually have salt pork, but I do have our bacon. So if you have watched any of my videos on raising a year's worth of meat, as well as raising the American guinea hogs, this is some of our bacon from the American guinea hogs, which I have to say, I have a podcast episode on what I thought about our experience with the American guinea hogs, the yield of meat that we got in comparison to the Hereford breed, which is what we normally in the past have raised when it came to pigs. But I have to say, with the American guinea hogs, they make the best bacon I have ever had, bar none. It is phenomenal. So instead of using salt pork, I use bacon. And this way you can still eat the bacon, but it really gives it incredible flavor. And speaking of meat, especially if you don't want to go to the store or you want high quality meat, this video is sponsored by ButcherBox. And ButcherBox is having where if you sign up right now and it's your first box with them, you get a free 10 to 14 pound turkey. So it's fed an all vegetable diet, no antibiotics, no preservatives, nothing is injected into the meat, and it comes straight to your door. So if you're not raising turkeys yourself, it is the next best thing. I have been very impressed with any of the food that I have gotten from them, including we did get a package of bacon to test against ours, and I have to be honest, it wasn't as good as the American guinea hog bacon that we've got, but compared to all the other bacon from the other breeds of pigs that we got, it was very good bacon and I was very happy with it. So you can click the link in this video and that will take you to the offer to make sure that you get a free turkey with your first order with them. So we're gonna add this in. I just like to chop it up. We're gonna add that all in there and let that infuse. And then after these are done cooking, then I will test this to see if I do need to add any additional salt. I'm not gonna add the salt right now. So because they're not fresh, they're similar to dried, even though we have soaked them, I'm gonna cook these on high pressure for 20 minutes. So these pressure cooked at high pressure for 20 minutes, and then I did a 15-minute natural release, and then I did a manual release after that 15 minutes to get the rest of the steam out. So we're gonna open these up. And here we go. So you can see our beans in there. And I wasn't sure exactly how much water to add. I wanted to make sure that I'd rather have excess water than not enough. So we are just gonna ladle these out. So you can see, textural wise, I see why they call them leather britches the whole way through. So they're not completely plumped up like you would have as a canned or fresh or frozen green bean, but they definitely have rehydrated quite a bit, and they're pliable. And the beans inside, those are soft. So now these are still super hot. So you can see what I mean why these look like the inside bean. You can use these as a shelled bean if they're fully developed, or as a green bean. But these ones are a little bit smaller, very similar to what you would expect from a navy bean. Definitely need some salt. Let's get a little piece of bacon in there, right? Bacon makes everything better. It's definitely a different texture than, as I said, fresh, frozen, or canned green beans. And it's chewier, but it's not like leather chewy. So I'm actually pretty impressed with the texture. I was expecting it to be more leatherier than it is. Now, granted, I did cook it under pressure, which I think helps. I know with the fresh Tar Heel green beans, which is what these are, if I'm cooking them fresh and not canning them, which obviously would be with the pressure canner, I have a video on that, on how to can green beans safely, then I know that you have to cook them much longer than you do other green beans, like a French green bean or a Blue Lake or something like that. They do require a longer cooking time. So if you cook these on a wood stove, I could see where you would definitely have to cook them 3 to 6 hours. And if you didn't cook them long enough, then they would be chewier and more leatherier than they are right now. Actually, these are pretty good. I think they would benefit from a little bit of garlic powder too. Like, I think next time I would either throw in a little bit of minced garlic, or maybe even a little bit of onion, or just sprinkle some garlic or onion powder on them when I was pulling them out right now. But if you're trying to do your own food security and not rely on the grocery store, this is one of the oldest traditional ways of preserving food without having any equipment other than a thread and needle, and just letting the air and nature preserve it for you, which is pretty incredible, because beans, especially these that have some of the actual shell part in it, is a significant, for a vegetable, a decent amount of protein in your shelled beans. And then you also have the green part. So, you know, this with a little bit of bread and then throwing in that salt pork, I mean, that was many a full meal for a lot of families back in the day, was just having the beans with some cornbread or biscuits and that little bit of salt pork, and this would have been their complete meal. And it definitely would have helped to meet the nutritional needs, especially without the aid of a grocery store. If you want to see the video where my dad tours and shares about the leather britches on the original homestead that my grandparents came to when they came out to Washington State from the Appalachians, you can go and check out that video, as well as the video of actually making the leather britches when we were harvesting and stringing them.